On March 7, 2025 at 6:08 p.m., the Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina, became the epicenter of an event that not only captured the nation's attention, but reopened deep wounds in the debate over capital punishment. The exact date and time of that winter sunset will remain etched in memory, not only for the inherent solemnity of an execution, but because of the peculiarity of its method. Brad Sigmon, 67 years old, a man whose name would resonate in headlines long after his death, was not executed by lethal injection, the predominant method in the United States, nor by the electric chair, an option that, though more archaic, is still used in some states. He was shot, yes, shot, by a squad of 3 state officers whose identities remained anonymous, inside a chamber renovated specifically for that purpose. The image of a man facing a firing squad, more fitting for a war scenario or a distant past, materialized in the heart of a U.S. state in the 21st century. It was the first execution by firing squad in the United States in 15 years, a time span that had seemingly relegated the method to oblivion, and only the 4th since 1976, when the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty. This made Sigmon's case an anomaly, a turning point that forced a reassessment of punitive practices. But why was a method considered obsolete brought back into use? Was it a pragmatic decision amid the shortage of lethal injection drugs, a way to ensure justice despite delays, or something more? Was it perhaps a symbolic act, a statement by the state? And more importantly, what did that joint shot tell us about justice and suffering in modern America? Sigmon's choice was not random. It was a declaration, a last and desperate form of control in a life defined by the loss of it. This is not a script about just another murderer, although his crimes were, without a doubt, brutal and harrowing for the victims. It is the story of a man who, in his final wishes, chose to die in an unusual way to draw attention to the system that brought him there, a system that to him was as flawed as the decisions that marked his own life. Prepare yourself for a deep dive into the dark intersection of law, personal choice, and the brutality of a predetermined end. To understand the gravity of Brad Sigmon's ending, it is crucial to understand the path of personal violence that led him to prison and, ultimately, to the firing squad. Brad Keith Sigmon was born on November 12, 1957, in South Carolina, a state that unknowingly would seal his fate. His life, like many others, was marked by complexities, but in 2001, a traumatic breakup with his ex-girlfriend Rebecca triggered a spiral of violence that culminated in a double homicide. Unmanaged emotions, resentment, and possible desperation drove him to a point of no return. On April 17, 2001, Sigmon broke into the home of his ex-in-laws, David and Gladys Lark, in what the trial would describe as an act of uncontrolled rage. He attacked them with a baseball bat, beating them mercilessly with a viciousness that left investigators shocked. Trial reports, cited by outlets such as the New York Post and International Business Times UK, detail that each of his victims received at least 9 brutal blows. The violence of the assault was so extreme that the Larkers suffered catastrophic injuries, resulting in their deaths. It was a crime of intimate and personal brutality, an act that made clear the level of anger Sigmon harbored. After the brutal assault on the Larks, Sigmon's escalation of violence did not stop. He took his ex-girlfriend Rebecca hostage in her own car. The situation was tense, volatile, with Rebecca's life hanging by a thread. However, in an act of courage, and with a sliver of luck that defied the odds, she managed to escape and survived the terrible ordeal. Her testimony would be fundamental in the ensuing judicial process, the voice of a victim who escaped hell. Sigmon, now a fugitive, was captured 10 days later at a remote campsite in Tennessee. His flight didn't last long, and with his arrest began a long and tortuous legal process. In 2002, less than a year after the murders, he was convicted of double homicide and kidnapping. The verdict was swift and forceful, reflecting the overwhelming evidence of the brutality of his crimes. He received 2 death sentences for the murders of David and Gladys Lark, plus a 30-year sentence for Rebecca's kidnapping. He spent 23 years on death row, a period of confinement and waiting that would transform him. During those more than 2 decades, his refuge, according to reports from his later years, was none other than remorse and faith, seeking some form of redemption or peace in the shadow of his imminent fate. But, as we will see, remorse would not be enough to change the course of justice. The death penalty system in the United States, with its intricate dance between law, ethics, and science, has faced serious challenges in recent decades, and the case of Brad Sigmon became a dramatic example of how these difficulties can force regressions to methods considered archaic. Until recently, South Carolina applied the death penalty only by lethal injection, a method that gained popularity in the late 20th century for its supposed humanity and effectiveness. However, the irony is that this very pursuit of a painless execution led to a dead end. The shortage of drugs, specifically pentobarbital and sodium thiopental, key components of the lethal cocktail, due to pharmaceutical companies' refusal to sell them for executions on ethical grounds, made executions difficult and nearly halted them in states like South Carolina. This shortage created a dilemma for states that wanted to continue enforcing capital punishment. In 2021, the state of South Carolina, frustrated by the delays and legal battles arising from the drug shortage, passed a law that reintroduced the electric chair and the firing squad as alternative execution methods. This decision, far from being a step forward, was seen by many as a regression to a more brutal past. The law was designed to ensure that death sentences could be carried out by offering options in case lethal injection was not available. In a macabre twist, the choice of method would fall to the condemned if both methods, lethal injection and the alternative, were available. If not, the electric chair would be used by default. It was in this legal and logistical context that Brad Sigmon made his choice. Fearing the torture of the electric chair, which he described with the chilling fear of being cooked alive, and the agonies of lethal injection, which to him equaled drown me, Sigmon opted for the firing squad. He knew it would be visceral, brutal, visually shocking, but crucially, the research he had done suggested it would be practically instantaneous. For Sigmon, the firing squad represented the lesser evil, the fastest and least painful path to death, a final form of control over a process that had stripped him of everything. His choice, far from being a whim, reflected the fear of the condemned of a prolonged and agonizing end, and at the same time forced the state to unearth a method that few believed they would ever see in action again. This decision, therefore, not only marked Sigmon's fate, but also unearthed a dormant debate about the inherent cruelty of each execution method. Brad Sigmon's final days were wrapped in an atmosphere of sobriety and macabre efficiency as the state of South Carolina prepared for a historic and grim event. On March 5, 2025, the clock marked the final 48 hours of Brad Sigmon's life on death row at Broad River Correctional Institution. In his cell, a small space that had been his world for over 2 decades, Sigmon devoted himself to one of the last tasks left to him: writing. He wrote several letters, a final legacy of thoughts and farewells. One to his daughter, the most intimate and personal; another to his pastor, a reflection of the faith he had found in confinement; and another, the most controversial and symbolic, to the state governor. In that letter to the governor, Sigmon did not ask for clemency or a last-minute pardon. His message was bold, defiant in its simplicity. "I do not ask for mercy. I ask for consistency. If you're going to kill me, do it the way I choose." And he chose. He asked to die by firing squad. This decision, far from being an impulsive act or an empty provocation, was the result of careful deliberation. According to his attorney, Sigmon had spent years studying each method of execution, consumed by fear, like other inmates before him, of the physical consequences of lethal injection, such as internal drowning or a prolonged death, and of the thermal horrors of the electric chair, which many described as slow torture. For him, the firing squad offered brutal certainty. Death would be quick. With the method choice confirmed, the prison mobilized for final preparations. Witnesses, carefully selected by the state and the defense, were summoned to observe the event. The squad of 3 state officers was designated, their identities shielded to protect them from retaliation or harassment. The chamber, a space specially refitted within the prison for this type of execution, was inspected down to the last detail. No failures could be allowed. It was a stripped, cold space, designed for one purpose only: death. A brick wall with a black X painted with surgical precision marked the exact point where Sigmon was to be placed, the target for the shooters. In front of him, just over 4 meters away, the 3 anonymous officers waited with bolt-action rifles, the weapon chosen for the task. To mitigate individual guilt and ensure no shooter would know for certain if their bullet had been lethal, it was arranged that one of them would fire a blank, a harmless round. Everything was ready. The scene was set, not for a trial, but for an act of final retribution. The tension was palpable. On March 7th, 2025, at 6 p.m., Brad Sigmon was escorted from his cell, his final steps in freedom within the prison walls. He wore a plain white uniform, unmarked, a somber contrast to the fate awaiting him. His hands were bound in front, a small concession to dignity or perhaps an unnecessary precaution. He walked steadily, with surprising composure for someone about to face death. Some witness reports, including accounts from AP News, indicated that he was smiling faintly, not with pride or mockery, but with a strange mix of resignation and perhaps for him, the feeling of finally being in control of something, of having made the last decision aloud to him. He was offered a hood, a common courtesy in executions to preserve the identity of the condemned and perhaps to avoid eye contact with the executioners or witnesses. He refused. He wanted to look his fate in the eye, a final act of defiance or acceptance. His choice to die by firing squad was already a statement, and his rejection of the hood was an extension of that same will to confront. He was strapped to a metal chair, a device designed to keep him immobile during the impact. Over his heart, the vital point, a white circle was placed, a target to aid the shooters and ensure a quick and accurate death. To his right, the chaplain murmured a prayer, offering a final spiritual comfort in a moment of raw reality. To his left, the doctor waited with a stethoscope, ready to confirm death, to certify the moment Sigmon's life would end. The solemnity of the moment was inescapable, even for the most skeptical. In the adjoining room, separated by a panel but connected by the finality of the action, the anonymous shooters received the order. A tense silence must have gripped the air before the command voice rang out. Aim! Fire! 3 shots rang out, slicing through the air. The synchronization, the echo of the rifles. One, perhaps, was a blank, fulfilling the tradition of diffusing individual responsibility. But 2, without a doubt, hit the mark, piercing the white circle on Sigmon's chest. Sigmon's body jerked slightly, an almost imperceptible reaction. Blood, warm and red, ran down his chest, a stain that spread across the white uniform. And within seconds, it was all over. Life was extinguished. The final breath escaped. Official time of death, 6:08 p.m. A brutal end, but for Sigmon possibly the clean end he had sought. In a moment loaded with immense tension, minutes before the squad fired, Brad Sigmon asked to speak. His voice, which could have been broken by fear or remorse, was clear and firm, according to witness reports. His message, surprising for its content and implication, was not a plea for his life, nor a final declaration of innocence, but a powerful appeal that transcended his own fate. To all Christians, please, do all you can to abolish this. Not for me, for those to come. Death must not be the final act of a broken system. These words, quoted by publications like People, echoed in the execution chamber, and later in media outlets across the country. It was a plea that, coming from a man condemned to death, carried unexpected moral weight. He did not seek compassion for himself, but for those who might face the same fate in the future. It was a call to action against the death penalty, a conscientious act at the threshold of death. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't show the desperation many would expect from someone in his situation. He simply asked for prayers for himself and, with a humility that surprised some, asked for peace for the families of his victims, David and Gladys Lark. This gesture, though late, was an acknowledgement of the immense pain he had caused. I repent. I've done so for 23 years. It's not enough, but it's all I have to offer. With these words, Sigmon articulated the burden of his crimes, a remorse that, according to him, had accompanied him during more than 2 decades of confinement. It was an admission of guilt, but also an expression of the futility of that feeling in the context of his sentence. For some, they were empty words. the last strategy of a man desperate to cleanse his image. They believed that his remorse, no matter how sincere it seemed, could not erase the horror of his crimes. For others, however, his words were the echo of a man who had learned, perhaps too late, what it meant to live with the weight of his actions. It was the lament of a conscience that, though tardy, had awakened. His final words were not a personal goodbye, but a public message, a plea for his death, brutal as it was, to serve a greater purpose: the abolition of capital punishment, a system that he, from his cell, perceived as fundamentally broken. His message, which resonates strongly, forces us to consider not just retribution, but the moral and ethical purpose of the death penalty in a modern society. Brad Sigmon's execution by firing squad reopened, with unusual force, the national debate on the death penalty, a debate that never fully ceases, but which this event catapulted once again to the center of public conversation. The central question loomed over the nation: is this method more humane than lethal injection, which often presents complications and prolonged agony? Is it a legitimate alternative that allows the state to carry out its sentences? Or is it a medieval regression, a step backward in civilization? Human rights organizations, historically opposed to the death penalty in all its forms, condemned the act vehemently. The ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, and Amnesty International labeled the execution a spectacle of institutionalized violence. They argued that, regardless of the method, the death penalty itself is a violation of human rights, and that the choice of a firing squad only emphasized its barbarity. To them, it was a demonstration of the state's willingness to resort to more primitive methods when the more civilized ones fail, revealing the true nature of capital punishment. But the governor of South Carolina and other proponents of the death penalty defended the measure firmly. Their argument was simple and direct: the people demand justice, and if the law allows it, we will carry it out. This stance reflects the belief that capital punishment is a necessary form of retribution for heinous crimes, and that the state has an obligation to fulfill it. For them, the choice of method is secondary to the need to fulfill the will of the people and ensure justice is applied, regardless of logistical challenges. However, international media did not hesitate to describe it as an execution with the flavor of a public punishment. This was not a critique of morbidity, but of the moral and symbolic implication. Deliberately and publicly shooting a man in front of witnesses in the 21st century, when society prides itself on its civilizational progress. The image evoked historical executions and recalled practices that most developed nations have long abandoned. The controversy surrounding Sigmon's execution was not just about whether it was legal, but whether it was morally acceptable, whether it reflected the values of a society that claims to be just and humane. The debate remained open, echoing long after Sigmon's body was removed from the chamber, a reminder that the death penalty continues to be one of the most divisive and morally complex issues of our time. Brad Sigmon will be remembered not only for the crime he committed, a brutal act of violence that claimed 2 innocent lives and left a family devastated, but also, and perhaps more significantly, for the way he chose to die. His execution was not quiet. It did not fade into the anonymity of a standard procedure. It was a message, a posthumous echo of his will to defy, to protest in some way against the very system that condemned him. It was, in a sense, an involuntary act of protest against the possibility of agonizing through a method he considered inhumane, like lethal injection or the electric chair. His choice of the firing squad, in all its rawness, became a declaration. His lawyer, who accompanied him until the end, encapsulated this legacy eloquently. He stated, "Brad didn't ask for mercy, he asked for a clean shot, and that's a sign of the kind of system we've built." That phrase is a chilling reminder that, in the desperation for a quick death, a condemned man may prefer the explicit violence of a firing squad over the uncertainty and potential suffering of supposedly more humane methods. Sigmon's choice exposed a flaw in the perception of humanity within capital punishment, forcing society to confront the brutality inherent in any form of execution. Brad Sigmon's case will be analyzed for years. It will be added to legal discussions about execution methods, providing a precedent and vivid example of the alternatives to which states may resort. It will also fuel the moral debate about the nature of punishment. questioning whether retribution should take precedence over the dignity or suffering of the condemned. And of course, it will revive conversations about the humanity of those who decide life and death, and the psychological implications for both executioners and the society that authorizes them. Because in the end, Sigmon did not die in a lonely cell, consumed by obscurity, nor with a needle in his arm in an act seeking the cleanliness of a medical death. He died facing his fate, staring down the barrel, eyes open. This final act of direct confrontation with death turned him into a symbolic figure, an echo of the brutality that sometimes hides behind the facade of justice. His choice, as uncomfortable as it may be, ensured that his death would not be in vain in the vast tapestry of the death penalty debate. It is essential to reiterate that this analysis does not seek to justify Brad Sigmon's actions. His crime was atrocious, an act of violence that left a family broken and a community scarred by the pain and tragedy of loss. The lives of David and Gladys Lark were brutally taken, and the suffering of Rebecca, his ex-girlfriend, stands as a lasting testament to Sigmon's violence. But his execution by rifles and gunpowder cannot be understood solely as the application of justice. It was a statement, an event that transcends the purely legal to delve into the symbolic and moral. It was a wake-up call, a piercing reminder that, in the United States, there is still room for methods that sound more like war than justice, more like a military act of force than a civilized judicial process. The image of the firing squad, resurrected in the 21st century, unsettles the notion of a penal system that is evolving toward greater humanity. And while that white circle is still remembered on the wall of the execution chamber, a macabre bullseye that marked the exact place of Sigmon's death, the question continues to echo with unusual force. Can an execution be just if it is carried out like in the days of lead? Can society consider itself fully just if it resorts to methods that evoke less civilized eras? The case of Brad Sigmon forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths, to examine the very essence of the death penalty, and to reflect on the meaning of justice in a world that seeks humanity even in its harshest acts. His death did not close the debate. It reopened it with renewed strength, reminding us that the road toward truly humane justice is still under construction. Do you believe that allowing a condemned person to choose their method of execution should be an option within a justice system? Or does this add an unnecessary layer of moral complexity?